everyone, and welcome back to the Sex Talk. Today, I am going to be joined by, again, Elle Hawkins, LCSW and sex therapist. Elle is here to talk about sex coaching versus sex therapy, but instead of saying the word versus, I would like to say sex coaching and sex therapy. I think that they complement each other, and there's a lot of overlap, but I definitely think there are complementary professions, and one is not better than the other. In fact, they sometimes do very different things, and so Elle happens to be both. And so today I would love to bring Elle back on the Sex Talk to talk more about sex therapy and sex coaching.
Sex Talk.
The Sex Talk. Hi.
Hi, Mo. Thank you so much for having me. And this is a topic that I really think a lot about as someone who is trained as a therapist and has also received training as a coach, and thinking about how do I differentiate the two? How do the two work together? And what might bring someone to a coach? And what might bring someone to a therapist? And at what times might someone be working with both a coach and a therapist?
Love it. I love this conversation. When I first started open my practice, I was doing writing for a magazine called Your Tango, and one of the founders of Your Tango was updating my profile or something, and she asked me, she said, "Do you coach?" And I said, "No, I'm a therapist. I work in California." And she said, "In California, there are so many sex therapists; it's oversaturated. And you're doing the rest of the country a disservice by not offering your coaching services." And so that's when the light sort of like went on for the first time in my head. And it's really true. I think, when you live on the West Coast, there is a different mentality than sometimes, in the other parts of the country. So I think it's profound work to be a sex coach. So let's dive in. I would love to hear about your journey, Elle, in becoming a sex coach and a sex therapist.
Yeah, thank you. So we were talking before this, and I was sharing that I grew up in kind of small town Florida, and the sex education that I received was incredibly minimal. I remember being in third grade, and they were playing those videos where they separated the genders, and then they were playing the video, and I remember raising my hand and saying, okay, I get that, like, the sperm gets into the egg and that's how a baby happens, but like, how does that happen? Do people just like lay next to each other in the bed, and then like the sperm hops across the sheets to get in? Like, what happens? And I remember just being laughed at, and I don't think I got the answer. And
Wow.
that's the one piece of sex education that I got. And so as I grew up, and as I got into high school, and I started making friends who were sexually active, as I became sexually active, what I really realized was that there was not a lot of helpful information about sex and sexuality. And the internet was just kind of getting started. It was just a slice of what it is now. And so I remember trying to search online for things, doing Ask Jeeves, because that was the search engine
Oh
back
my gosh, ask me. Yeah.
then. and just getting to these websites that, looked, I don't know if you remember websites back then, but they were like neon pink with like neon green writing. And it was just like very bare bones. And I was going, I don't know how accurate any of this information is. It was so hard to sift through. And so that's when I said, well, I really want to be providing accurate, non-judgmental information for people to be empowered to make the choices that feel right for them sexually. But I had no idea how to go about doing that. I didn't have very good education myself. I had never seen a sexual health professional that I was aware of before. Like I said, it was just a video that one of the teachers like pressed play on, and then, hoped that no one would ask questions. And then when they did, got uncomfortable and moved on. And so the only sexual health professional that I had ever had concept of was from the movie Meet the Fockers, when Barbara Streisand plays a sex therapist. And of course, the way that we see her playing a sex therapist is not what you would actually see from a sex therapist in real life. She was like climbing on top of clients and things like that. And I was going like, but you know, for all I knew, I was like, oh, okay, well, that must be the one way that you can do sexual health is to be a sex therapist. So that's what I'll do. And that started me on my journey. And it wasn't until much later that I really started to understand what sex coaches were and how they operated. And, you know, since then, I've learned, you know, I could have taken a path of being a sex educator. I could have taken a path of being a sex coach, the sex therapist, obviously. But there's also, you know, sexological body workers and all these different ways that people can reach out and get help from different kinds of sexual health professionals. Yeah, so that's part of what led me to talk
Well,
today.
you know, it's, you know, often ask this question of my clients when I'm first doing like a sexual history intake with them, like, where did you get your information about sex? Where did you actually learn about sex? And most people have that answer, like they found Playboy magazines under their dad's bed, or they, you know, they saw a movie that said something. Like, it's very disjointed. No one ever has this like, you know, comprehensive sexual education. They've just sort of like pieced it together based on what they heard in the locker room, based on what they saw on TV. Like, no one really knows what, and like the full ins and outs of sex. And then when you ask people about it, people are like, oh yeah, I know everything I need to know about it. So there's this feeling of like, well, I've got it, because we don't get a comprehensive sex education. I think that people just assume that they know everything about sex that they need to know because no one's talking about it. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your journey into sex coaching and then sex therapy. Like, how did all of that come about?
Yeah, so I actually, about a year ago now, a little bit over, I was going through the training with Somatica, which is a training for sex coaches, and it's really somatically based. And I really just did that as a way of better understanding what coaching is. It was around the time that I was going back into direct therapy, and for the first time kind of going into like private practice with you as part of the group practice. And so I was really kind of thinking like, well, I've heard about coaching. I've heard about, you know, I mean, I know about sex therapy because I've been involved in that for the last 10 years. But, you know, what are really the differences, and what is coaching like, and what is therapy like? And so what I really appreciated about the Somatica method was that it was very different than therapy in some ways. So a lot of the foundational understanding of sexual health and understanding of attachment and human relating was involved in there, which was very neat and interesting. But also they did a lot of somatic based interventions and would actually use themselves as a vessel with clients, where they would practice flirting with one another, which, for example, is something that a therapist can't do, right? And in fact, the Somatica method allows for touching and kissing, but their limitations are that clothes need to stay on, there's no kissing on the mouth, and there's no touching of genital areas. But that really provides, in a very different way than therapy, the ability for people to kind of play and explore with their own embodied experience. And so, you know, that really kind of got me thinking about like, wow, you know, coaching has a variety of different benefits that can be offered that you can't get from therapy. Now, different coaches are going to have different boundaries around that. So if someone was looking for a particular coach, they might look for some coaches that do experiential kind of interventions like that, you know, or they might say, you know, no, that actually feels pretty uncomfortable for me. I want someone who maybe has boundaries that are more like a therapist, where there's maybe not touching or not engagement. But that's really the benefit of being able to look at coaching instead of therapy, is that you can really kind of say, oh, wow, the opportunities here are very different. You know, I think the other benefit of coaching that was really clear for me was just like what you said, is that because therapists are licensed and they're licensed in a particular state, we're not able, even if we're meeting remotely, we're not able to meet with a client if they're physically in another state at the time of the session. And so, for me, I'm nomadic, right? So I live in different states for a couple months and then go to a different one and that sort of thing. So for someone who's like me, who moves around a lot, or maybe someone who travels for work a lot, doing the work with a coach that doesn't have state specific licensure and has more openness in their ability to meet regardless of where the person is, that might be a really good fit too. So once again, it just comes back to this thing of like, there's different ways that you might get served. For me, I'm primarily a therapist, and in fact, right now I'm not doing coaching. But as I'm working on a project on the side, wanting to support people who are navigating dialysis and the impact on sexuality, in that different area, I'm working towards building a program which would include some coaching from me as well. And so, thinking about, well, why is it that I'm doing that? Well, one is that specifically in that role, I want to be able to offer it on a national level because it's such a niche area. The other thing is that wanting to, knowing that it's going to be, the intention of that program is going to be more focused on in the moment responding to what's happening and moving forward. Whereas with therapy clients, I'm often looking at, oh, okay, what are the things that have impacted you in the past that might be contributing to this? I'm also looking at what are different things that might be going on with like mental health and how is that impacting it and how are we addressing that as well? And that's a barrier that like coaches aren't able to do, because coaches, really have to stay in that realm of kind of coaching solution focused, coaching in the moment, coaching moving forward, which is so helpful. But if there are underlying issues, that's a really great time for a coach to refer out to a therapist to be working in conjunction.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to sort of piggyback on that. When I began doing sex therapy work, I often found like, gosh, I would really love to be able to like give them hands-on, more experiential offerings. And as a therapist, I wasn't trained in anything that was hands-on. And so really early on, I started working with surrogate partners. So surrogate partners are a type of sex coach. Most of them are certified through a program called the International Professional Surrogate Association, IPSA. And IPSA is actually based in LA, and the founder is Vina Blanchard, who happens to be a friend of mine. And so I started working, quite often with surrogate partners, and surrogate partners work in tandem with a psychotherapist or a sex therapist. So the client goes to see the surrogate partner, and then the client also sees a sex therapist right afterwards, or the psychotherapist. And basically, they kind of do what you were saying. They basically simulate a relationship from the beginning to the end. They simulate flirting, touching for the first time. They talk about consent. They build trust before they move into the intimacy piece. And then once they move into that piece, there can be a variety of, different things that they do to like celebrate intimacy and celebrate pleasure and learn about their body. And then it can include penetrative sex. It can include oral sex, all of that. And then at the end, there's actually a piece they have to break up. So they learn how to have a healthy breakup. And so for many years, I did that working with a surrogate partner, because that piece offered that hands-on piece. If someone really wanted to get out of that stuckness, if they were stuck because they had never had sex, like the 40-year-old virgin type thing, or if they were experiencing pain during sex, like vaginismus or vulvodynia, this sort of like experiential therapy or coaching, which is technically is coaching, allowed them to be able to sort of like break down barriers that they wouldn't necessarily be able to get in the office with me. So I found it to be really profound. And so, just going off on a tangent on just one type of sex coaching, but this is where sex coaching can become really helpful. And with surrogate partners, they can travel to work with the client, or the client can travel. So that, there are no state lines or international lines, no boundaries. You can kind of go wherever and do this type of work. I think there are some places that won't allow it. Like California is a state that allows that kind of work. So you do have to like kind of be careful about the laws. But, that's just one type of sex coaching. And like you said, depends on the therapist or the coach. What are their boundaries? What are they comfortable with working with? And what does the client need?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, you just gave a beautiful illustration of, I had mentioned earlier about when a coach might refer to a therapist. And then, on the other hand, a therapist noticing that having experiential or hands-on interventions might be helpful. That's a great time to then refer to a coach. And then as we talk about coach, like you mentioned, it's an umbrella term, and there's many different kind of levels and of like provision of services that fall under that. And so thinking about, is this someone that would be best served by, kind of a coach that does some hands-on experiential with, certain boundaries? Is this someone who would really benefit from having more of a kind of fully engaged, like, uh, the word that comes to mind is like relational stimulation, but the truth is that it's not a simulation, because all of these providers are actually, when they have been trained and they have gone through a coaching program or are part of the surrogate partner association, what they're really trained to do is to tap into their authenticity and authentically relate. And I think that's so important to know, because many people kind of say, well, I don't want to show up and just have someone pretend with me. And it's like, no, actually, they are trained to really show up in their full authenticity, which means that sometimes there's going to be like conflict that might come up as like at a relationship that wasn't kind of consciously crafted in that same way. And and like that's all part of it too, right? So that's really really cool, and something I really appreciated about my training as a coach as well.
Yeah, well, the work requires you to have a relationship. Even as therapists, we have relationships with our clients. We build strong relationships. We care about each other. And part of the surrogate partner, one thing that we would always let clients know is that you will be developing a relationship. You're going to be having a relationship together. And that's why the therapy piece is there, so that you have someone to sort of process along the way as you're developing this really strong relationship with your surrogate partner or your coach or whoever it is. I think a good coach is going to also be working with you around, these are my boundaries after the program's done, because clients do get attached, and therapists are really great with these boundaries. And I think that, depending on the type of coach you're working with, as we're talking about surrogate partners, they're really great with boundaries. At the end, it's done. There's no relationship. You can't contact me, that type of thing.
Right.
So
Yeah. Well, and I know that, part of like your passion of making sure that people have access to providers that are knowledgeable in like sexual health and sexual satisfaction, you have actually started your own coaching program, and you are now like training people through a lens of really like someone who's really experienced with sex therapy and with coaching. You've been training them how to move forward, and I would love to hear more about like your program and like what are some of the the boundaries that you're training people to have, or like what is the approach that someone might expect from someone who's been trained by you to be a coach?
yeah, this has been coming up a lot. So my program is fairly new. I just kind of launched it earlier this year, like full-fledged, and have a full, cohort and students that are in the course. And because I come from a therapy background, and because we're 100% online and on Zoom, the course is based, it's more focused on sex education and learning as much as you can about sex and relationships, so that you can help clients kind of like this, on a video call. Now, just yesterday in class, I went over all of the different types of sex coaches, so that the students who they have, they're so excited to do this work, just to let them know, like, it doesn't have to be on Zoom. It doesn't even have to be no hands touching. So, we started talking about one thing that I did early on in my career is I used to host these workshops in LA, at the Liberace Penthouse, which are really cool. They were called Sexy Saturdays at the Liberace Penthouse. And one day after the workshop, we had this idea of going to to Pleasure Chest, going to a sex shop, because so many people were just saying like, and this is way before like people were shopping online. This is like maybe 2010 or something like that. So people were letting me know that they were uncomfortable going to a sex store and buying a vibrator, or, shopping for these types of toys. They felt uncomfortable, they were embarrassed. And so we went on a field trip. And that's the type of thing that a sex coach can also do, right? Is accompany your client somewhere where they feel uncomfortable. One of the coaches in my program works with non-monogamy, and he accompanies clients to swinger clubs if they feel like they need like a wingman or some support around going somewhere where they might feel uncomfortable. So while my program is 100% online, it's all done on Zoom. At least right now, that's what it is, because it came out of a pandemic. And that's how I work with my clients. And I do a lot of coaching with my clients. I have a lot of clients that live in other countries and out of state. And we specifically work on very specific problems. I have a separate business where I do therapy and a separate business where I do coaching. So I try to keep them separate. Sometimes there's certainly overlap. So I try to let my clients know. And in the program, I try to kind of educate around the differences between therapy and coaching, and recognize that I come from a therapy lens. And so always trying to steer it back to coaching, and providing more education and information around the coaching piece, because it's so much broader. And I think that in the therapy world, there tends to be some, I don't know if snobbery is the right word, but maybe a little bit of that. And, encouraging people to look and see what, how the two can complement each other. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my advice for people who are looking for a coach or looking for a therapist is to do a consultation, and one, really kind of be curious about what is your training, what is your experience, what is your lens, how are you approaching this? Because even though therapists are licensed and have had to go through a certain level of education, a certain level of training, there's not necessarily a requirement when it comes to sex and sexuality, right? And so, and similarly, with coaching, it's going to be important for you to know as a consumer, is this person kind of experienced in things that I'm wanting to lean into? What is their lens? Does that fit with like how I'm viewing this, or what would be beneficial for me to view this sort of thing? But like you were talking about kind of the snobbery with therapists that can kind of happen around coaching. And the truth is that there's going to be many, many therapists that are not going to be a good fit for someone. There's going to be many, many coaches that are not going to be a good fit for someone. But that just because they might have a much more helpful time, and someone might be much more knowledgeable as a coach, right, than a therapist that they may have found, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, once again, always being curious about, how does this person feel to me? Do I believe that they're competent and capable? Do I feel connected with them? Even in a 15-minute consult, you can get a sense of, do I connect with the energy that this person is putting forth? Do I feel like I'm going to be able to open up with them? And that's going to be the most important component as you're thinking about working with anyone, whether it's a therapist or a coach. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to add about my program is we focus heavily on interpersonal, like ourselves. So I really strongly encourage people and have people, the very first thing that they do is self-evaluation. So there's a lot of work on the self and recognizing your stories, your biases, what you're bringing to the table before we actually start working towards how do we work with clients, how do we build a business. But all of that is things that I teach in the courses, not just how to work with clients and how to build a business, but what's going on with you. Like you said, there's something else I was going to say about what you were just talking about, doing the consult. Anyway, I forgot. It'll come back to me.
Yeah. So I was actually just thinking it might be kind of fun for you and I to just kind of brainstorm, like, what are the pros and cons of therapy, and like, what are the pros and cons of coaching, just so that we kind of like, popcorn it and lay it all out. So
yeah. So should we start with the pros of therapy?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. If you don't
Oh,
mind, I'm just going to throw this in there because it kind of ties into that. I actually was doing a consult with a therapist, and they said, the people that I'm seeing, their relationship is great. They just seem to have this like dysfunction around the sex. Like they can't, and I said, well, it maybe kind of sounds like they need coaching. And the therapist was like, why hadn't I thought of that? So I think that, there are, very clear cut instances sometimes, and sometimes they're not as clear cut. So let's talk about the pros and cons of each now. So,
yeah.
um,
So when I think about therapy, one of, a lot of the pros and cons are kind of connected. So we'll just stick with the pros, but know that like we'll come back to the con side of things too. But a pro with therapy is that because therapists are required to be licensed, that gives you a way of holding them accountable. So for example, in California, I'm licensed in California. If I was ever to do something that felt unethical or operating outside of my competency, that any client could call the board of behavioral sciences and say, hey, I think that this person needs to really be looked at and evaluated. And so there is like a course of action for people to advocate for if they feel like they're not getting the care that they need. So that's one of the pros of therapy.
that's pro. I will say that another pro is that your therapist is going to be able to, as we talked about last week, help you with healing your trauma. So past trauma that come up, a therapist is a trauma-informed therapist, of course, is much better suited than a coach to work through trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see, other pros of therapy, I would say, is that you are going to have a relatively clear picture of the kind of education that they will have gotten, and that they will have gotten an education that is focused on understanding mental health. Um,
Yeah, for sure. A big one is the ability to bill insurance.
yeah,
Even if the therapist is not in network, you can, most of the time, if you have a good insurance plan or any insurance plan, is at least seek some sort of reimbursement from your insurance company. So therapists can, and many do, work within the medical model, which can be helpful.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think those are the big ones that jump out for me when it
Yeah.
comes to like specifically for therapy, because there's such an overlap that sometimes, yeah, that there's other benefits, but I wouldn't separate them from coaching necessarily.
Right, right. Well, and I, just to add the mental health piece, if you're struggling with something that has to do with mental health, anxiety, depression, anything that is mental health related as well as sex related, so psychosexual, then a sex therapist is much better suited for you.
Yeah.
So let's talk about, do you want to go to the pros of coaching or the cons of therapy?
Let's go with the cons of therapy since we
Perfect.
keep it fresh in our mind. So, and actually there's one that jumps out that's kind of a pro and a con. So the pro and the con would be the therapy boundaries. So on one hand, having very clearly delineated boundaries that we have to follow by law, right? And by our ethical kind of like demonstration from our national associations and that sort of thing. So the way that that's a pro is that people can feel kind of safe in that container of like, this is what I can expect. I'm not going to be touched. I'm not going to be, engaged with in a way that's like eliciting sexual or erotic connection, right? But on the flip side, the con of that is that limits the ability to be able to do some of the work that might be helpful for the
Right.
person.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I would say that's true of the medical model as well. I think that a lot of therapists, because therapists can work via the medical model, a lot of clients will want to go through their insurance, which requires us to give a diagnosis, which requires us to sort of medicalize and view the problem from a medical lens, giving a diagnosis, sort of labeling things. And I don't necessarily love that. So that's, to me, also a con.
Yeah. Yeah. And even just to like kind of pull on that even further is that the medical model does lend itself to have this sense of differentiation between client and therapist that can feel a bit like expert to the person who needs to just listen and do what I say. Right. And
Yeah.
that's actually not the most conducive for having a positive therapeutic relationship. And that can actually, I think, get in the way of a lot of healing. So, once again, that's not going to be every therapist, but there absolutely can be that kind of like expert to the person who needs to just listen and go along with it kind of dynamic versus, what I call the like educated peer model, where it's like we're both humans, we're both navigating this wild, wonderful, weird world. And yeah, and I just happen to have certain experience and training, right? That's going to help me kind of provide additional information. But I think that when we're just talking generally, the therapy model might kind of lend itself more to that like expert to the person listening versus the coaching, which is usually more of a peer-to-peer collaborative model. That being said, certainly there's going to be coaches that are going to come in and say, no, you need to sit down and listen to me. And many, many therapists that come in and say, hey, how can we build this together?
Yes.
So just something that generally speaking, that model might lend itself more towards the other.
Yeah. Another con for me is I always have found the therapy, not the sex therapy community, because the sex therapy community tends to be a little different than the therapy community. Therapy community feels very, to me, rigid, and also very conservative. Even though sex therapy is within the scope of practice of most therapists, of all therapists, I think with the exception of AP or of LPC or something like that. I think unless they're actually like steeped in the sex positive sex therapy work, I've found the communities to be a lot more conservative and rigid. And so that has always been a huge turnoff for me. And I like, thank you so much for the sex therapy community, because without them, I probably would have left this profession a long time ago.
Yeah.
Find it to be rigid a little bit.
Yeah. And that reminds me of another one that I would say is like a double-edged sword, which is with, therapists, our ethical guidelines are that we are using evidence-based information. And that can be really helpful because it means that we're not kind of just saying, oh, I just thought of this. This seems helpful. Let's just do it. And there's not a lot of like backing behind it actually being effective or not. So that can be really helpful to make sure that we're not necessarily engaging in a way that is going to be, well, and I don't want to say that it's not going to be harmful, because sometimes it can be. And that's the other side of the double-edged sword, which is that a lot of evidence-based interventions are really focused on white, cisgender, heteronormative experiences. And so that's where it's that double-edged sword of, on one hand, there is a scientific backing behind therapist training. And on the other hand, knowing that that can be limited too. And so if you might run across some therapists that say, oh, I'm just going to do this by the book, and that might work for some people, but it might actually be harmful for others. And so really making sure that a therapist that you're working with has a humanistic approach, because that part of being a therapist can either be helpful or it can be harmful. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just remember to always, there's to find the right fit for you, right? You can do sessions with therapists, consultations to find your right fit. Yeah. So let's dive into coaching now. Positives of coaching.
Yeah. So a pro that comes up that I was going to mention on the con list of therapy, but a pro is that you can see a coach when you're anywhere in the world, in any state. There's not location restrictions for coaching in the way that there is for therapists.
Yes, I love that. Across state lines, international, anywhere in the world you can. Another thing that coaches can do that I've mentioned before is accompany you to a swingers club, to a sex toy store, meet with you in person in the community to help you develop skills. Not that therapists can't do that. They certainly can, and some do. But with coaches, this is something that might be totally in a coach's repertoire as opposed to a therapist.
Right. Absolutely. Let me see other things that come up. We talked about already the ability to engage differently and the ability to really, there's ways as a therapist that I use my personality and my sense of connection with other people, but it's very limited, right? For example, as a therapist, I would never flirt with a client, even just to be practicing those skills. That's really outside of like our ethical guidelines. But a coach could be flirting with the client and could be engaging in a variety of different kind of like physical connection, physical touch, and embodied experiences together that's intended to be experiencing erotic connection between the two of them. And that can give real life experience that then is very transferable to parts of their life outside of the coaching relationship.
Yeah. You know, I'm going to piggyback on that and say that therapists do have a technique called role play. So sometimes a therapist might role play something with you, but it doesn't necessarily look like that. It's probably going to be a little bit more confined with a lot more boundaries versus a coach might actually flirt with you and take you to a bar and do it in public. You know, there's just a lot more fluidity and flexibility with what a coach can do around that. Great.
Right.
A
Right.
lot of great reasons to see a coach.
Yeah. Yeah. Like you were saying, like a therapist, when I think of what a therapist who is working with someone to develop flirting is, you know, maybe those questions about like, oh, if you were to flirt with someone, what would that maybe look like? You know, if they were to respond positively, how would you respond? If they weren't to respond positively, right? Whereas as a coach, I have permission to flirt with you a bit, Mo, right? If I was a coach with you, Mo, I might, you know, kind of say, okay, Mo, just take a moment, take a breath. I'm going to flirt with you a little bit. Just notice how you feel in your body, what comes up for you as I do that, right? And then I might like lean in, make eye contact, and kind of smile and get into my body, and then say something like, I just would really love to kind of brush your hair back behind your ear because you look so beautiful right now, right? And then I might ask, like, what came up for you? How was that experience like? What would you maybe respond to? Where it's a much more interactive in that way.
Right, right, right. I love it. Yeah, there's so much. Plus, of course, the hands-on work that we mentioned earlier. Surrogate Partner, Somatica Institute, they teach how to do hands-on work. There's also sexological body workers, people that do sort of like erotic massage or yoni massage. Those are also coaches, tantric coaches, all sorts of coaches out there, and lots of different schools that teach different types of coaching, you know. So you can go to the specific school, like if you want to have a tantric coach, go to a specific tantra school and go to their directory and see who their coaches are. It's the same with sexological body workers. There's so many different types of focuses when it comes to coaches, sex coaches that do different types of body work, like experiential.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm wondering if we should switch to some of the cons that.
Yep. Let's do it.
So I think the first one that comes to mind for me, I was talking with you a bit before we started recording, was, you know, growing up in small town Florida where there is, you know, not adequate sex education. There's a pretty homogenous culture and there's a lot of judgments around a lot of aspects of sexuality. Is that anybody can say, I'm a sex coach, because there's not a lot of there's not any kind of like regulation or requirement around it. And so while the benefits that we talked about earlier come from that, also the idea that there can be someone who's maybe like perpetuating pretty harmful ideas saying, oh, I'm a sex coach. And what that means is that I'm going to help you change your sexual orientation so that you're more in alignment with like this religion or something like that, which we actually know to be actively harmful, right? So, you know, just thinking about when you're interacting with a coach, once again, those questions of what is, you know, what background you have, what experience you have, and like, how do you approach coaching? And like, what are your basic, like, kind of values and ideologies behind it, can be really helpful to make sure that you're sussing out someone who's maybe bringing their own personal agenda into it versus someone who's coming in with conscious intent to help you explore what's important to you and help you find your most authentic path.
Yeah, definitely do the research on the coach, read their testimonials or rewatch their testimonials, you know, reviews, things like that. Actually, you can't have those on therapist pages. So That's a con for coaches, and a pro too, I guess. So we're talking about cons for coaches. So bad, like bad coaches that are spreading misinformation, as Elle mentioned. I would also say coaches that don't have the education. So Elle's talking about coaches that are promoting themselves as sex coach, but they're actually doing something similar to like reparative therapy. And I'm talking about coaches that are calling themselves sex coaches and they really don't know what they're doing, because anyone can call themselves a sex coach. So they don't have a lot of background, and we can't really check their credentials, those types of things, which can make it hard. And you just never know if they're giving you good information or bad information. So, really, I think checking in with yourself in situations like that is key.
Yeah. And very kind of like in the same vein of that is that as therapists, we have ethical guidelines about not overpromising, that, we need to be reviewing with clients about, what are the potential ways to address different issues that are coming in so that they know there are different options, and to really give realistic expectations about how likely this is to succeed, or what the time frame will be, and that sort of thing. And so something that I see really often is some coaches kind of presenting themselves like Cosmo magazine, where it's like 10 things to change your sex life forever. And it's like, yes, those things might be helpful, right? But we can't guarantee that in 5 sessions or something, your life's gonna be totally transformed. But because there's not the same level of like regulation and accountability, really thinking about like, do these promises seem a bit overreaching, right?
Well, I think, that's the thing. That's a definite con, is that coaches will target that pain point that you have, like those coaches that are like, get your ex back, make him notice you. You will find those coaches. And I had, my former co-host here at the Sex Talk, she would say, like, you're in your most vulnerable state, and there's this, thing pops up on the internet that's like, how to get your ex back. And of course you're going to sign up and buy all the things that they're selling. And so that's certainly a con, is that they're aiming for that place that's already in so much pain to make their sell. So, and that might be helpful for you in the moment. And they might have exactly what you need at that moment. It's just something to be aware of.
Right. Just in that, where it all comes down to that sense of really trusting yourself, and really, just anchoring that you are going to be the most important component. And then if anytime working with a therapist or with a coach, if it's actually feeling like they are leading you down a path that doesn't feel right for you, if it feels like they are maybe operating outside of their competency or something, I think people often kind of can get to a place of like, well, they're the expert, so I guess I'm wrong. But knowing that you do have a lot of innate wisdom, and if it doesn't feel right for you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're bad at what they're doing or anything like that, but it just means that maybe they're not right for you, and that you can really kind of trust and lean into that. That's important.
Yeah, great. Anything else that you can think of?
I don't know. I think we hit a lot of points.
Yeah. So if you've ever wondered what a coach does, I think we've covered a lot of that, and kind of also what a sex therapist does. You had mentioned the Fockers at the beginning and how she was climbing on top of people. And, I think we're coming out of those days where people don't know what a sex therapist does. But I hope, if you didn't know, I hope this cleared up. And most definitely, if you have any more questions, please leave them in the comments and we will happily answer them for you. Anything else you want to, add before we get off this call today?
I mean, I think just as you were talking, I was like, oh man, I really wish it would have been so easy for Meet the Fockers to have labeled her as a sex coach, which actually would have been more accurate. And I think really could have expanded people's understanding of what's out there. So I hope that the people who are watching today do feel more informed that there are multiple iterations of sexual health professionals that they might out for, and that sex therapy is phenomenal and can be so helpful to different people. Sex coaching is phenomenal, can be so helpful for different people. And it's not that one's better than the other, but it's really more about what is the best fit for you
Yeah.
in the moment of your journey.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion as to what a sex therapist and a sex coach are, and people probably think that they're the same. So I think this is a valuable video session that we've done for people. So thank you so much, Elle, for providing us with all your expertise again. And that was the sex talk.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mo. Always a pleasure.
All right.
The sex talk.